Um, I want to ask you about happiness because I know so many people are suffering with that. I think I once was it you? I heard you say that you like tried antidepressants for a little bit and then you got off, but you weren't depressed, right?
Well, I was going through a period. It's a long, long time ago now. I gotta stretch back in memory. I was going through a temporary period. I knew it was temporary. I knew it wouldn't last. And I just read that book. I think it was called Stumbling into Happiness, or maybe I read The Happiness Hypothesis. I think it was The Happiness Hypothesis. And the Happiness Hypothesis basically said there are only three proven ways to kind of be happy. And I forget exactly what all of them were. I think one of them was cognitive behavioral therapy. Another one it said was antidepressants and pharmacological substances. And I actually forget what his third point was. Honestly, I didn't think they were very good. At the time, I thought they were good. Now, in hindsight, I don't think those were what I follow. But I was curious, so I said, okay, let me try this. So I took an antidepressant for 6 weeks. It was one that takes 6 weeks to have effect, and I noticed at the end of 6 weeks that it turned me from a slight pessimist, which is where I was naturally at the time, to a slight optimist. And I was like, wow, this actually works.
Did
But
you
then I
feel
stopped.
very, did you actually feel very depressed when you were younger?
I would say I didn't grow up happy. I was a pretty unhappy person, but kind of for all the wrong reasons. One is I just didn't value happiness. I had other things that were way more important to me. So
Like,
it just, well, like any desire will cloud your happiness, right? Think of happiness as your natural state. It's like the sun shining, but any single desire is a cloud covering that sun. And most of us have many, many desires. So those clouds cover the sun in many cases, completely block it out. And sometimes you have so many unresolved desires and issues and anxieties that they just completely blot out the sun, and it does it for years at a time, then you lose track of why you're doing it. So I don't think one should necessarily give up on their desires. You're a biological creature walking this earth. You're going to have some desires, have some fun along the way. But just if you realize that your desires are what blot out the sun, then you just want to be very, very careful which ones you have. And if it seems dark and gloomy, it's because you have too many desires running at this moment in time. So it's more just kind of an observation, and it's not to say that I don't. And I would. It's rare for me to be to be unhappy these days, and it's I would have to stretch far back into memory to find the last time I was genuinely unhappy. But at the same time, it's not like I'm happy most of the time. That's not a sustainable state either. What I more go for is calm and peace, because peace, can be converted to happiness at any time. I think I said this before, but I think peace is happiness at rest, and happiness is peace in motion. So if you are living a very peaceful and calm life, but then you engage in activity, you will naturally find that that activity is happy. Although if you set out to be happy, you won't get there. It's kind of one of the ironies of the loaded word called happiness. But I think peace is the real deal, and I definitely think you can find it, and you can find it just by observing when you are and you aren't at peace. But the most important thing is you have to value it. If you value it, you'll find it. If you don't value it, that's fine too. It's just because you're valuing something else. You're valuing career success, or you're valuing finding a mate. Those are actually the two most common, money and the opposite sex, survival and replication. Those are the two biggest clouds that cover our natural innate happiness. One way you can see that we're meant to be naturally happy is just watch little kids, right? Little kids running around are naturally happy. If a
yeah.
child is not happy, you say, what's wrong? Right? On the other hand, if you see an adult who's very happy, you say, "What's up?" Which is basically asking what's wrong, right? So it's our expectation that children should be happy, but it's our adults that adults should not. The
Yeah,
expectations adults should not. And why
yeah,
is that? Because puberty is the beginning of desire. You can see children when they go from being happy little go-lucky play kids who are playing with whatever's there in front of them in the moment to suddenly they hit puberty and then they discover desire. And it's the most basic desire, the desire to replicate, the desire to find the opposite sex. And then, of course, in our society, even though these kids are biological adults at the age of 9, 10, 11, we imprison them because we don't trust them. Modern society is more dangerous. You can go get somebody pregnant, and that's not acceptable. You could kill somebody, that's not acceptable. You could die by doing too many drugs, it's not acceptable. So the teenagers are biological adults who actually are held as prisoner in homes by parents. And the parents become these reluctant wardens, and the teenagers now are sullen against them because 5,000 years ago, 14-year-old would have been out fighting a war and maybe raising a family. Uh, and that's just not how modern society is designed. So we have to hold these children captive against their own will, and we throw them into this false game, this fake made up royal pageantry of high school where there's popular kids and unpopular kids, and they just play the stupid false game. But deep down, they know it's a meaningless false game, and so they end up pretty depressed because they're not actually living out their biological urges. So there's kind of this transition from being naturally happy to being naturally unhappy with suppressed desires, where you're socially programmed all day long. And I think in some ways, getting older and and wanting to be happy is sort of rediscovering your original childlike innocent state. But now, a child is happy through ignorance. They don't have to worry about where they're going to sleep or how food's going to get on the table or anything like that. And a middle-aged person is kind of unhappy because they know too much. They're like, shit, I got to work for everything. I got to make everything work, or it's going to fall through the cracks. And, and I have no safety net. I am the safety net. And then an older person who's closer to death goes back to being happy like a child, but they do it through wisdom because they realize actually it doesn't matter. I'm just going to die anyway at the end, and this all goes to zero. So all of these treasures that I was accumulating, whether they were mental or emotional or physical, they're all going to disappear anyway. So I think
Right.
that wisdom is a return to innocence, but by way of knowledge rather than through ignorance.
Have you tweeted that yet, Naval? Because I think it's time if you haven't.
Well, the problem with Twitter is like everything is out of context, right? So you get attacked over everything, which is why I like Clubhouse better sometimes. In
Oh
fact,
my
the only
God.
time I get attacked because of Clubhouse and someone take excerpt something unfairly and then tweets it and then somebody else attacks it as being
The
stupid.
that's the biggest
Twitter's
that's
ex
the biggest loser move ever, by the way. But I wanted to ask you, going back to finding a mate, did you did you find that getting married made you significantly happier?
I've always been in, committed relationships as far as I can remember. That's just kind of how I'm hardwired. Um, did getting married make me significantly happier? I, I think like when you're a single person, you just waste an enormous amount of time. And you're always like hanging out in environments that you normally wouldn't choose, like certain parties or certain dinners or maybe even social institutions. You do a lot of things to just meet the opposite sex in kind of a sublimated sex drive, and you don't really acknowledge that's what you're doing. Whereas when you get married, like all that time frees up, right? Like you can literally free up 5 hours a day as a young male by being married. On the other hand, marriage itself takes effort, and having children takes a lot of effort. So it's not like you get that free time to just be yourself. You have to actually go do something. I mean, you have new responsibilities that take that over. I think, look, marriage is a vehicle ultimately for having children, right? So I know there are people who kind of get married and don't plan on having kids, but I would question whether marriage is the best route, because no matter who you're with, they could be the most interesting, attractive, perfect person in the world. You're going to get bored of them after a decade. It's just human nature, especially if you follow this Disney romantic philosophy of you have to get everything out of one person. That just doesn't exist. We have multiple friends, right, for our intellectual endeavors. So I think that uh, ultimately the point of marriage, at least the biological point of marriage and the historical point of marriage, is to have children. And what is the point of children? Well, you're here because you're children, so it's a self-fulfilling tautology. But also, I think children give you the unique opportunity to genuinely love something more than you love yourself. And I think that is really important for being happy, because the moment you love something more than you love yourself, you're no longer self-obsessed. You're no longer thinking about yourself all the time. And the source of misery is thinking about yourself all the time. It's being overly, involved with self. Like people who are depressed, they shoot themselves in the head, because that's the thing that won't shut up. A depressed person's mind is talking to them too much, not too little. It's a Zen monk whose mind is relatively blank, and so you have to find something bigger than you in life eventually. And if you don't, you'll blow yourself up. Maybe not physically and literally, but probably mentally. And so that could be children, that could be God, that could be a cause, that could be some personal spirituality, that could be some movement, it could be some circle, it could just be the 20 cats that live in your apartment and you love them to death. But whatever the heck it is, you got to love something more than you love yourself, because if you don't, you'll blow your brains out.
That's so true. My most miserable friends are always, always thinking about themselves, and the world revolves around them. Um, and and then you also find that people who dedicate their life to service are are not depressed at all. Like you'll never see someone working in a soup kitchen,
Yeah.
serving homeless people.
I want to be very careful here though, because I do know people who are very hedonistic and very happy.
Hmm.
And I do know people who are like committed themselves to feel good, look good service and are very unhappy. So it's not quite perfect that way, right? Like it's not the case that the person in the soup kitchen is automatically going to be happy. I would say if the person who's in the soup kitchen working there to help people, they genuinely, deeply want to help people. They're not
Oh,
there for
right.
the social credit. They're not there to be seen. They're not there to be happy. They're not there that somebody will notice, oh my God, you're making a sacrifice in the soup kitchen. You're so good. Then I think they have a shot. But I think the person in the soup kitchen who's hoping that they will be seen and stand out, they're needing validation from the outside and they're trying to fulfill that through work in the soup kitchen, they're going to be miserable. The same way, someone who may be self-obsessed and hedonistic, but they kind of don't have expectations out of society sort of approving of what they're doing, that person is free and may actually end up very happy. So I think we have to be very, very careful anytime that our notions of what is good for the individual line up with what is good for society. If you see like, oh, that person's behavior is good for society, usually it's actually bad for that individual. In fact, the whole point of social programming is to say to somebody, hey, I know you want to do X, but you got to do Y because X is selfish and Y is good for society. But anytime you see that something lines up very neatly where something looks like it's good for the individual and good for society, it's probably not true.